Everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is a very special one. I'm super excited about it. Today I'm going to be talking about a single contact case. This one is a multiple witness case. It's incredibly extensive. It's a very early case as well, starting way back in 1932, long before that this subject had any popularity really at all. So that alone I think makes it a very important case. But what really makes this case special is how extensive it is and the information that the witnesses were able to get from the ETs, who are very much human-looking ETs. These ETs also provided all kinds of predictions that turned out to come true. It's such a fascinating case. I call this episode the Onboard UFO Encounters of Leo and Mike Dworshak. This case deserves to be far more well-known than it is. I don't want to take too long in the introduction. Let's just get to the story itself. There are 12 at least major events, onboard encounters. It just gets better and better as time goes on, so do stay tuned to the end because it's really amazing all the way through. So the first incident I'd like to talk about, I call the first encounter. UFO contact often starts at a very early age. Leo and Mike's case does not appear to be generational. It was sheer happenstance, synchronicity, luck that allowed them to have this encounter. But it was this first encounter that started everything. It was a warm summer afternoon in 1932 as Leo Dworshak, then a 12-year-old farm boy from the tiny town of Killdeer, North Dakota, and his 8-year-old brother Michael Adam Dworshak, they had just finished their chores, and as they usually did, they went hiking around in the countryside. They were about 1.5 miles east of town, standing on the top of a small hill, when Mike was the first to notice a strange disc-shaped object sitting in the field in the valley below them. As Leo says, it was a huge round thing, as big as our barn at least. We just stood there gaping at it and began excitedly discussing what it was doing down there and trying our best to understand just what we were seeing. This building or machine was unlike anything we had ever seen or heard of before. It was silvery, perfectly round. It looked like polished metal. I counted many different colors of light on it that came from a band around the edge. It was totally silent. Now again, they had never heard of UFOs. Few had at that time. This object was a half-mile away in an area where there were no roads, no signs of civilization. So they decided to walk closer to get a better look. And this is when something very strange happened. As Leo says, as we began to walk downhill towards the machine, we were still more amazed to find our way blocked by an invisible force that would not let us get any closer. It was as if we were bumping against an invisible fence or wall. So they tried moving to the side, but no, they could not get any closer. So they just sat down and watched, and both were filled with questions about what this object was or could be. After several minutes, the flashing light stopped, an opening appeared, and a ramp slid down to the ground, and 3 men emerged. Each wore identical jumpsuits. They began to walk around the craft as if studying the environment. At that time, there was a huge grasshopper problem in the area, and the government had started spraying pesticides. They wondered if there was a connection there. It turned out later that they were right. The strange men were outside for only a few minutes, then returned back into the craft. The boys were too distant to see much detail on the men, and by now it was getting towards dusk. So Leo and Mike went the 1.5 miles back to their farmhouse. The craft was still there when they left, but they were eager to return the next day to see if it was still there. As Leo says, this was the most exciting thing we had ever seen. So the next morning they rushed through breakfast and their chores and excitedly returned to the spot only to find that the craft was gone. They were bitterly disappointed. They wondered, in fact, if they had actually imagined it, but they had both seen it. They remained consumed with curiosity, and 3 days later they returned for a third look, but there was still no sign of the craft. They began to visit the area regularly on the off chance that it might come back, but each time nothing was there. Was the first encounter, a really amazing close-up sighting of a landed UFO and humanoids. Pretty unusual certainly for that era. But this was just the beginning. The boys had no idea at that time really what they were even looking at. The idea of UFOs and ETs had not quite occurred to them yet, but they certainly could tell that what they had seen was really unusual. And they were really hoping for a second encounter. And of course, that did happen, as we shall see. Thankfully, the boys didn't give up searching for this craft, and their patience was rewarded. It was about 2 weeks later, they were exploring the valley where they had previously seen this strange machine when they actually saw it flying silently overhead. They rushed back up to this small hill and hid behind some bushes and watched as this craft landed in the same spot it had landed before. And as before, the colored lights flashed around a ring on the center of the craft and then stopped and went out. The boys tried to approach, but again found themselves blocked by this weird, invisible force field. They noticed that everything was eerily still. Not even a blade of grass moved. And as Leo says, while we sat by the barrier and watched this huge machine, the strange door started to open. A total of 6 men emerged from the door and walked down the ramp. Both boys were amazed. They took a close look at these guys. Instead of jumpsuits, they were now wearing what looked like fine, new-looking clothes, shirts and pants. They began walking around the ship and then bent down and started picking up samples from the ground. Now, although the men ignored the boys, both boys felt that the men knew they were there. And they watched the activity for about an hour until it started to get towards sunset and they knew they had to go home. Now arriving home, they did tell their parents about what they had seen, and their parents listened and admitted that it did sound like a strange airship, but were not very receptive and told them not to talk about it. And as Leo says, we were very disappointed at their response to what was for us the most exciting experience of our lives. The next day, disappointed by the response of their parents, they went to town and sought out a gentleman by the name of Mr. Brooks, who they thought was very worldly, and they expected that he might be able to explain what they had seen. So they shared their story with him, and to their delight, Mr. Brooks not only believed them, he said he had seen a craft around town too. He said it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and he assured them that it wasn't our military, as the boys had been speculating, which meant, of course, that this was a spaceship of some kind. So then and there, the boys vowed to try and meet these men from the UFO, and they began to return regularly to the spot. But as before, there was no sign of it, until one day, a few weeks later, it was there again. Amazing is that. Already we're seeing a very early report of what we would call the Oz effect, with this eerie stillness surrounding a UFO event. Super interesting is their report of this force field that kept them away from the craft. There are quite a few reports like this, but this I think is the first one of its kind. Such a shame that their parents weren't more receptive, but I'm very glad they did find a gentleman in town who had had his own encounter and was able to reassure them that things like this do happen. And again, this is just the beginning. They were soon to have much more dramatic encounters. So let's move to the next segment, which I call the third encounter. As they had now grown into the habit of doing, they crisscrossed the valley where the UFO had twice landed, hoping to see it again and wondering what it was about this valley that was of such great interest to these space people. To their delight, the craft appeared overhead and descended slowly and silently to the ground. As the lights stopped flashing, they walked closer, and this time they were able to approach to only about 800 feet away before they hit this now familiar invisible barrier. Once again, an opening appeared in the craft, the ramp slid down, and several of the men walked out and began to study the environment as they always had. This time the boys tried waving and shouting to draw their attention, but the men seemed absolutely oblivious to their presence. Mike suggested that it was perhaps because the sun was behind the boys and the men couldn't actually see them. But Leo knew that they were close enough to the men that the men had to see them. And somehow he just knew that the men were ignoring them so as not to frighten them. As it got darker, they decided that they had to return home. Mike really wanted to stay longer, but Leo, being older, knew that they would both get in trouble if they stayed after dark, and neither of them wanted to incur the wrath of their parents and perhaps be grounded and not be able to go to this field. So they returned home. The next day, they searched the field for any sign of the craft, but there was none, which was really strange in itself. They really thought that there should be landing traces, but there was none. And returning day after day and seeing no sign of the craft, they wondered if perhaps maybe they were going crazy and just seeing things. But their curiosity always won over their fear, and they returned repeatedly. Almost always it was not there, but their patience was soon rewarded when a few weeks later the craft was back. And again, it was always late afternoon. Third encounter, it was clear to both of the boys that this was something really unusual. They were super excited about it. This was the biggest thing easily that had ever happened to them. They felt very certain that these ETs, at that point they weren't even sure if they were ETs, but whoever these people were absolutely aware of them. And they had the very strong feeling that they were friendly. So both of them were eager to actually have a face-to-face encounter, and that's what they were pushing for. So they were just trying to get closer and closer to these ETs. They were very persistent, and their patience paid off because soon they would have the fourth encounter. The boys hiked to the valley, and this time the craft was already there. They crept down the hill until they hit this force field and then just sat down to watch. Now as they did, they saw a rabbit leap towards the craft. It too hit the barrier, bounced off, and ran away in the other direction. So they now knew for sure that they weren't imagining this force field. Both boys watched the same events occur, the door opening, the ramp coming down, the men exiting the craft and studying the environment. So by now they were becoming increasingly convinced that the men were spacemen from other worlds, but still they wondered. As Leo says, we got a peaceful feeling from them. Their movements near the ship were peaceful and purposeful. I got the feeling they probably were making a survey of some kind. But this time something new happened. They watched the men enter into the craft, the lights began flashing, and they felt the ground actually vibrating. This time they heard a loud hum, which suddenly stopped, and the craft immediately lifted up. The colored lights began flashing. The craft got about 10 feet above the ground, then darted off so fast it looked almost as though it had disappeared into thin air. This was the only time so far that they had seen it leave. They wished that they had a camera so they could prove this to people, but their family was far too poor at that time to own a camera. But both found themselves becoming increasingly obsessed with this craft and these strange people. It's all they talked about. They tried again to convince their parents, both who listened and again told them that they were just imagining things. They tried telling their friends and other kids in town who were equally unreceptive. And being of German ancestry, they were sometimes mistreated by the other kids in town who kind of shunned them because they were a little different. So they ended up speaking with Mr. Brooks again, who again reassured them that he believed them and not to worry about what other people thought. So they continued to hike to what they now called Spaceship Valley, and they were continually disheartened to see that this craft and these men were not there. But then one early evening in late August, their patience was again rewarded with another astonishing encounter. Fourth encounter was incredibly amazing to both the boys, but it was also somewhat stressful. They were still wondering, could they be going crazy? But now seeing that rabbit actually hit the force field, that confirmed to them that it wasn't just them feeling this. They did again try talking to people as we see, but were not getting really any good reception from people. It was becoming clear to them that nobody was going to believe them and that they were on their own with this. But they weren't going to give up. They were getting closer and closer. And then came another encounter and events really ramped up this time. So now we move to the next segment, which I call the fifth encounter. They were at the bottom of the hill, getting ready to explore Spaceship Valley this time, when the craft appeared in the sky and slowly settled to the ground. And this time it was closer than ever before, maybe about 200 or 300 feet away. And something really unusual happened. As Leo says, as the ship approached the ground, we found ourselves immersed in the invisible field of force. It came over us like a flood of water that got thicker and thicker as the ship dropped lower and lower until we could not move. As before, we couldn't get any closer. And now we couldn't get out. We were caught inside the shell of force and were unable to free ourselves no matter how hard we tried to wriggle or strain. So at that point, they just gave up trying to escape. Neither felt any real fear at first, just wonder and awe as the amazing door opened and the men emerged. And it was clear to them that the men knew about them and would not hurt them, but being trapped as they were, they did feel a sense of panic and fear. So the door opened, the men emerged, and as always, the men ignored them. But again, both were certain that the men knew they were there. Both felt a very strong sense of being watched by them, and they were now close enough to see that the men were talking to each other. And again, both had the very strong impression that these visitors were studying our planet and were in fact concerned about the grasshopper invasion, the crop failures, and some of the invasive plants that were taking over the environment. So they were trapped there well beyond sunset, and both were very nervous about coming home in the dark. They were afraid they were going to get in trouble, and at that very moment, as if the ETs were reading their minds, the force field released them, and they went straight home. To their great relief, their parents, totally out of character, said nothing. By now, they were mature enough with their experiences that they told nobody else. They knew no one would believe them, it was their secret, and that's just the way it was. Amazing is that, seeing this UFO come down and then being stuck in the force field itself, not being able to move. This was obviously and understandably quite frightening for the two boys, but at the same time, they still felt this overwhelming peace and friendliness coming from these beings. It was clear to them by this point that these beings were probably extraterrestrials. It was simply the only explanation which fit. But now the contacts were getting so close that this was becoming the single biggest thing on their minds at all times. Both of them were starting to talk about subjects that were well beyond their age, and they couldn't wait to have another encounter. And sure enough, events would soon escalate. I call this next segment the sixth encounter. It was only 3 days later, on August 28, 1932, that Leo and Mike returned to the valley and they had their sixth encounter with the space people. It was already approaching evening when they arrived and the craft was already there. This time they walked within 100 feet before they felt this familiar force field stop them. So they got their best look at the men ever. They could now see that these men were very slender, very good looking, and except for the strange jumpsuits, looked entirely human. They all looked very much alike, almost like twins. They looked quite young, they had no facial hair. Again they tried waving at the men and calling out to them, but again got no response. The men just continued their mysterious behavior of poking at the ground, picking things up, and conversing among themselves. Mike grew impatient, and this time he started jumping up and down, screaming and shaking the bushes to get their attention. And of course it did. As Leo says, that did it. Several of them were looking directly at us now. I wanted to thump him on the head. We found ourselves enveloped again by that silent invisible wave that locked us into place. So Leo told him, "I hope you're happy now. They have us stuck like a cow in a mud hole again." Mike said stubbornly, "At least they know we're here." So as darkness settled, the men returned to the craft, which took off as before, and immediately the force field dissipated and released the boys. So they ran home. The next morning they returned and inspected the valley, and again were very puzzled to find no sign of the men or the craft. They returned home, but knowing that the ship usually returned in the afternoon, they went back the same day, because by now both Leo and Mike began to sense when this craft would be there and when it wouldn't. And most often they were correct. so they stopped visiting constantly and would only go when they sensed that the craft would be there. And to their amazement, as they had suspected, after just a short wait on the hill, the craft approached and landed again. Both boys felt like the sixth encounter was a little bit of a setback. They wondered if perhaps they had made a mistake, pushed too hard, but they were not going to give up. They knew by now that this UFO was showing up at certain times. In fact, they started to get a sense of when it would show up. Certainly they knew it was coming in the afternoon, but it was more than that. They started to really feel when it might be around. So they would continually hike to Spaceship Valley to see if this UFO was there. And of course, it would be on some occasions, sometimes not. But things were about to get even more intense when they had their seventh encounter. This time they were high on the hilltop when the craft landed, and they immediately approached, but this time they hit the force field almost immediately. And this was quite upsetting to them. They wondered if perhaps Mike's behavior the previous day had caused the ETs to become more wary, or if the spacemen even cared about two little German farm boys who kept pestering them as they were trying to survey the valley. But still, they waved, and to their delight, this time the men responded. The men waved back, but then continued on with their strange activities. So this was very heartening to the boys, and both felt that sooner or later these men would let them come closer and maybe even go on their ship. The men continued to wander around seemingly randomly, and then one by one returned to the ship, all except one, who to their amazement began to approach them. As Leo says, "He came quite close to us, maybe 10 or 12 feet away. Whatever was holding us seemed to have no effect upon him. He looked directly at us and smiled in a peaceful and friendly way, raising his hand with the open palm towards us. Then he turned and walked directly back to the ramp and entered the ship. The door then closed, and suddenly the force field released. The boys were tempted to run towards the craft, but decided it was better to be on their best behavior and impress the men, who they felt were still watching them. So they decided that they would not interfere with the men unless they were actually invited. These repeated encounters consumed the boys' attention by this time. They began to talk of subjects well beyond their years. This, of course, caught the attention of their parents, who began to question them about it. And once again, Leo and Mike shared their series of encounters, and this time their parents took them seriously. But after listening, advised them not to speak to others about it, as they would not understand. But they decided that they would speak with Mr. Brooks again, who encouraged them to try to achieve their goal of meeting the spacemen and going on board their craft. So several days later, they went to Spaceship Valley in the afternoon, and sure enough, there was the craft. And this time, they would have their closest encounter yet. They were a bit disappointed that they weren't able to get closer during this encounter, and yeah, they felt like perhaps they had pushed too far. But what's super interesting is that this was the first time the ETs officially recognized their presence and waved back, so that was definitely a step forward. And they were soon to have a contact that would change everything. This time, they actually were able to speak to the ETs. So I call this next one the eighth encounter, face-to-face contact. And now things were going to change drastically. Reaching the hill, Leo and Mike were absolutely delighted to see the craft had already landed and the spacemen were milling around. So they walked forward, and to their amazement, this time there was no force field stopping them. They were able to walk right up to the craft and the men until they were only 10 feet away. So they stood very still and very respectfully and just watched. The men seemed both welcoming, but also did not at first react to their presence. As Leo says, "We just kind of stood there watching, ready to run if they yelled at us. We could hear no sounds in the strange stillness so near the tremendous ship. This close, we were nearly overwhelmed by its huge dimensions." So they got their best look ever at the men. They could now see that these guys had light brown hair, a beige complexion as though well tanned, blue eyes. They did notice their shoes had no laces or buttons on them. Their clothes looked normal enough, but very clean and of a strange shimmery fabric. They wore thin gloves on their hands, but again, all looked very similar in appearance. As Leo says, these men were alike as peas in a pod. They occasionally looked at us and smiled, and then continued with their exercises. There were 3 of them, and they stood there and looked at us. Their smile was like ours, probably more gentle and relaxed than ours, maybe more gentle than any smile I have ever seen. So it was Mike, the younger brother, who finally worked up his courage and spoke out loud to them in a mixture of German and English. And at first there was no response, but 2 of the men went back into the ship, and the 3rd guy walked straight up to them and said in German, "I can speak your language. We speak all languages of all the people on your planet." So both boys had tons of questions they wanted to ask, but they felt strangely tongue-tied and could only get out a few words. Leo ached with desire to go on board the craft, but both boys just stood there stunned and silent. Finally, one of the men approached and said again in German, "Boys, you have had quite an experience with us. You have showed great determination in coming to visit us again and again. You have seen much, you have learned much, and you know more about us than most people in your world. No one will believe you when you tell them about us." The man then looked at Leo straight in the eyes and said, "Not until you are an old man. No matter what you tell them about us, they will still not believe you. In your own minds, you will always know the truth about what you have experienced and felt." So the man repeated the words in English and then began to share even more information with them. The man said, "We are very real, and we are from another galaxy. We have traveled to your planet for over 5,000 years. We are from a place far beyond your world by millions of years of time. We continue traveling to your planet because it is part of our responsibility. We are showing you a small part of what you can expect in the future. You cannot learn everything at one time without rest. You will see us before long. In the meantime, you must go home and rest, because your minds are not big enough to learn everything as quickly as you would like. Remember, you must believe what you have seen and understand what you have learned, and try to understand that we are not here to hurt anyone." The man then smiled, stared another few seconds. Leo managed to mumble a thank you and said that it was time to go home. The man smiled and said, "Yes, it is." At this point the man returned to the craft. The boys left for home, their minds whirling. Both had many very strong impressions, as if information had been downloaded into their minds. The men they knew were far older than they appeared. Both felt certain that the men could read their minds. They felt certain that the spacemen were there because they cared about the health of the planet. Both boys also felt a very strong connection to the men, as if they had almost become a part of them. They knew that these guys were very intelligent, very advanced and peaceful, and wise beyond understanding. The boys were somewhat overwhelmed by this very close encounter. Again, they kept it a secret, discussing it only to each other. Now, around this time, their life at the farm became very busy, and it was a few weeks before they had the opportunity to visit again. But on September 19, late in the afternoon, the opportunity arose, and both again had the strange feeling that the craft would be there when they arrived. Both felt certain that their opportunity to go inside the ship was coming very soon, and that it was only a matter of time. And Mike were very lucky they had each other. Being unable to talk to really anyone about this was very stressful, but they did have each other to talk about and verify the events that were occurring. And both of them were incredibly excited. Both felt like the time was coming that they would get to go on board. And of course, they were right. That would happen with their next encounter, which I call the 9th encounter, on board the craft. And this was the ultimate UFO experience for the boys, and really one of the most interesting onboard encounters I've ever heard. Arriving at Spaceship Valley, as they expected, there was the craft. It was now dusk. The craft sat there in total silence. None of the men were visible, so Leo and Mike cautiously approached. Again, there was no force field stopping them as they walked right up next to the craft. Suddenly, they noticed that 2 of the men were standing next to one of the landing legs supporting the craft. One of the men spoke to the other man and told him, "These boys would like to touch our ship. Make sure it is well grounded, for we probably have developed some electricity in our travels." The man then gestured to them to touch the craft. So they did touch it, and both were absolutely amazed because the craft felt smoother than glass. They could feel no heat nor cold, and in fact Leo said his hand slid across the surface almost as if the craft wasn't even there. That's how smooth it was. At this point one of the men stepped forward and offered his hand to shake. Both boys shook the man's hand, and Leo thought to himself, "I sure would like to get into that ship." As if reading his mind, the man said, "I think that can be arranged." The man explained that first they would have to be decontaminated and that they used light to accomplish this. And he began to explain many things. He explained how the magnetic force field was able to keep them and others from approaching the craft without permission. And he told them that once they entered the ship, quote, "You will soon begin to see things that will be coming to you in the next 30 years. At this point, both boys felt again that information was being relayed directly into their minds, telepathically, and they weren't immediately aware of all this information. Both felt all the men knew exactly what they were thinking. Leo began to explain to the men about the droughts in the area, the insect problem, the economic depression, the political unrest that was brewing in Europe. The men seemed to understand, and in fact were communicating these exact things to the boys, making it clear to them both that humanity was in for very difficult times ahead. In fact, they felt that these men were communicating these very ideas that they were bringing up. And as Leo says, they gave us the indication that man would soon bring terrible wars and suffering upon himself. Now neither of them realized it, but both were being downloaded with information about the future, knowledge that would come back to them years later as the events the ETs warned them about started happening. The men warned them that humanity must have freedom in order to advance, and if freedom is taken away by corrupt leaders, people will revolt. They told the boys that taxes on the people were a huge burden and would cause people to start resisting their governments, which will lead to social upheavals. They predicted that there would be a civil rights conflict between white and black people. They said that government corruption was the root of humanity's social problem. Now the boys had still not entered the ship at this point. Both were overwhelmed somewhat by all this, quote, adult talk, and they began to get really impatient to enter the craft. Finally, as if reading their minds, the ramp came down and the men escorted the boys up. They walked through an outer door and this beam of light came down, and this was the beam of light that disinfected them, got rid of all the germs. After that, both boys were told to remove their infected earth clothes and were given special clothes by the ETs, which amazed the boys because these new clothes seemed to magically sort of wrap around their bodies. All the seams disappeared. Once these new clothes were on, only then were they allowed through the inner door into the interior of the craft. Inside, they were amazed to see that the interior was very bright and clean. There were no visible light fixtures. The first thing they noticed were the chairs, which adjusted to fit their bodies and would turn towards them whenever they sat down. All you had to do was point at the chair and it would swing towards you. So Mike was delighted by this and began playing with the chair, trying to outwit it, much to the great amusement of the ETs. Leo saw that there was a rectangular screen about 5 feet wide, 4 feet high, which showed images of places and processes that Leo did not recognize or even understand. On one wall he saw what he would later compare to a computer, though of course at that time there were no computers, so he didn't really understand what he was looking at. They were then taken to another room where they were shown sleeping compartments with comfortable beds. They were taken to yet another room, which turned out to be a bathroom with fully automated toilet facilities. They saw no towels or tissues or anything like that. They were then taken to yet another room, much larger, which seemed to be some kind of laboratory filled with all kinds of alien equipment, which they could not describe or recognize in any way. Leo asked them about it, and they replied, "No matter how we explained it to you, it would be impossible for you to understand it." So Mike turned to them and asked them, "Why do you keep coming to our valley?" They replied, "We study the life patterns." At this point they looked at the walls and were surprised to see that the walls were actually partially transparent and allowed them to see a view of the outside valley and the sky. Most of the men continued to work busily and paid little attention to the boys, except for the two who had escorted them onto the craft. So at this point, they went back into the main room with the chairs and sat down while one of the men explained to them about planets, stars, and galaxies. As the man continued to explain things, suddenly there was this weird shift, and both boys found themselves outside on the hill being shown how grasshoppers lay their eggs in the dirt. This may have been a telepathic image, but it seemed to them like they were outside. This they knew was one of the things that the spacemen were studying in their little valley. But a moment later, they were back in the chair, this time being taught more about galaxies and magnetics. The ETs showed them that they had the ability to stop a bird in mid-flight and actually demonstrated this for them. They explained that this ability was to protect them from unwanted outside influences, and that if they didn't want anyone to approach their craft, they would not be able to. They told Leo and Mike that they were continuing to visit this planet, which would find itself in increasingly turbulent conditions. The ETs told them a few other enigmatic things. They said that they used 12 senses. They said that there were 12 of them who live full-time on Earth and have offered to help our world many times and were, quote, rejected every time. They also said that there were 12 galaxies populated and working together for the betterment of all. The number 12 seemed to come up a lot, which puzzled Leo. But as Leo says, these people from another world must be asked and must be made welcome before they will give advice. They said that if we eliminate things that are harmful to our bodies, we can increase our lifespan up to 250 or 300 years. So the boys estimate that they spent about 1 to 2 hours on board the craft. Both the boys said that they had learned all they could at this time, and the ETs agreed, because at times Leo said he found it hard to distinguish his own thoughts from those of the ETs. That's how closely they were communicating telepathically. So as they got ready to go, the ETs assured the boys that they would meet again. Following this contact, Leo and Mike did not have any more major encounters for a pretty long time. They did continue to see the UFOs on and off over the next few months, almost always at the same location. The experience was transformative for both the boys. This would affect them for the rest of their lives, and it would not be their last encounter. It would be Mike's last onboard encounter. From this point on, Leo seemed to be the main focus of contact, and it wasn't long before he was taken on board again. So I call this next segment, On Board Again. In 1933, Leo did see the craft land southeast of nearby Dunn Center, again in North Dakota, and he said it visited that area several times. But in 1936, Leo, now age 16, saw the ship land and he decided to approach. This time his brother was not with him. The ETs must have anticipated his arrival because once again he was not hindered by any force field. It was the same craft, and 3 of the ETs were outside waiting for him. He said it felt like it was meeting old friends. He did not have to ask to come on board. They immediately invited him in. Again, he had to go through the whole disinfecting, but inside, the ETs again talked about their concern for our planet. As Leo says, they said the world would have many problems. They would not interfere in any way with our handling of these difficulties. They reaffirmed that this planet was their concern, that man had his own mind, and that he must learn to take care of his planet if he wants to keep his home. One other strange thing they confirmed was what my mother said before she died, that I would be the last surviving member of my family. They said I would see the world in a lot of trouble before the year 2000. I did not provide any other information about that particular onboard experience. Honestly, I think he could have written an entire book on each one of these single encounters because these were not short little onboard encounters where someone's taken into a craft and physically examined. That's not the nature of this contact at all. It's a very friendly, interactive, benevolent contact with human-looking ETs. Really extraordinary. And from this point on, Leo continued to have many more encounters. So I call this next segment, More Encounters. Now, despite the fact that the ETs had warned them repeatedly that no one would believe them, or perhaps because of it, Over and over again, 30 or 40 times, both Leo and Mike tried sharing their experiences with others, and not once were they taken seriously. Not once did anyone truly believe them. In 1938, Leo, now 18 years old, was driving near Watford City, close to the Missouri River Bridge, 2 miles south and a mile and a half west of the bridge, so you can see the approximate location here, and he saw the spaceship sitting on the ground in a field off the road. He pulled off the road and walked up to the ship and met with the ETs. He held a conversation with them about the state of the planet. It was 1 year later, September 15, 1939. Leo is now 19. He was driving to Watford when he saw the craft about 2,000 feet in the air. He was directed to turn off onto a dirt road. He followed it down for about 3.5 miles and came upon the craft sitting 300 feet off the side of the road. As he walked up to it, the door opened, 2 figures emerged, waving at him. As he approached, one of the figures put his hand on Leo's shoulder in their customary greeting and said, "It is good to see you again." The other one said, "We always look forward to seeing you. We feel you respect us deeply." That, as far as Leo concerned, was a huge understatement, because he considered them his very close friends. One of the men said, "You have changed quite a bit since 1932. And Leo replied, "I have noticed no change in you at all. I don't quite understand this, but it does not really concern me." But the ET answered his question and said, "We are several thousand years ahead of your time. We are germ-free, and our life expectancy is quite different from yours. At this time it would be impossible for us to explain to you how we have accomplished all this in our lives. These things you would not understand. But we can assure you, if your scientists would devote their time to increasing your lifespan, people on Earth would be capable of living in good health much longer than you do now." So Leo, noticing that the craft was very bright, he asked them if they were not worried about being observed, and the ETs replied that they had stopped all movement for 3 miles around the craft, and they said, "It will be some time well in the future before people will be able to understand and do much, if any, of what we are capable of doing now. This new understanding will make a tremendous change on your planet Earth." So they then invited Leo into the craft again. Once again, he went through the same decontamination process. Leo told them, "I understand, and I am not as scared as my brother and I were back then." The man smiled and said, "We will never forget those 2 frightened children that approached us back then. We knew you were there and tried to handle and treat you in such a way that the 2 of you would not be frightened. We knew your thoughts and understood your determination and your belief that we do exist. You must always continue to have faith in yourself, for faith and determination are your future." So after decontamination, Leo was handed the ET clothes, which he put on and they formed to his body. He went in and saw the familiar chairs and the large screen with the enigmatic images on it. This time he asked them about the image, and they said, "The image comes from our galaxy, which is many millions of miles away. It is only meaningful to us in our work here. Do not waste your effort in trying to understand it." So Leo then asked them how they were able to illuminate the craft without lights, and they explained that the metal of the craft itself is luminous. So they talked for a while until it became late, and it was time for Leo to leave. One by one, each of the 6 men said goodbye by placing their hand on Leo's shoulder, and he did the same to them. He explained that it was dark, and he would surely stumble in the darkness on the way to his car, and one of the men told him, "We will take care of that problem." So Leo exited the craft, walked down the ramp. He savored his last moments of touching the craft, and walked off. This is when he noticed that the ground before him was illuminated with a mysterious light guiding his path to his car. Turning around once he reached the car, the craft was no longer visible, and he drove off. It was soon after this, as the ETs had predicted, that World War II broke out. Leo joined the Navy, and Mike, when he was old enough, joined the Army. In 1948, Leo was discharged and moved back to the Killdeer area. He occasionally saw the craft but did not attempt contact. In 1950, he moved to Bozeman, Montana, and spotted the ship occasionally. Mike, very sadly, was killed in action that year. This, of course, affected the family profoundly, but especially Leo, who lost the only person who shared their encounters. Years later in 1962, now married with 3 young daughters age 8 and under, the ship appeared again. They were driving, and after maneuvering to follow the craft, they came upon it hovering about 200 feet away and 20 feet off the ground, flashing with colored lights. Leo's 3 daughters and their 2 young friends immediately became very frightened by this sight, which disappointed Leo because he wanted his family to see this. So they watched it for almost an hour. He actually flashed his headlights at the object, but finally, because his daughters and their friends were so scared, he drove off. 1 year later, he spotted the craft while driving between Ennis and Sappington Junction. This time another car stopped and watched. A husband and his wife got out and watched wide-eyed as the ship began to land. Leo offered the husband to follow him to the craft, but the husband became very frightened, said he'd seen them before, he did not want to see them again, and drove off. Again, Leo was disappointed that nobody seemed to be able to understand or share these encounters with him. The ETs had predicted, as they had told Leo, he would have a real difficult time sharing his encounter with others, and that's absolutely the truth. Everyone he spoke to did not believe him. Yes, his parents did take him seriously at this point, but didn't show the same kind of interest that certainly he did. Very sad that his brother passed away, because this left Leo all alone in the world in terms of somebody who could share his encounters with. So this became his very special private secret. He did start sharing it with his family, but attempts to bring other people into the contacts were met with failure. So this was very frustrating for him. And as the years passed, he's had less encounters, but he did have one amazing final encounter, which is truly astonishing. And I call this one the final encounter. On the night of October 21st, 1963, Leo, now 43 years old, had his final encounters with the extraterrestrials. He was driving again near Ennis and Sappington Junction when, missing them and suddenly feeling their presence, he returned to the area where he had seen the craft land earlier. And sure enough, there it was. There were 6 people moving around the craft. 2 approached him, and one greeted them in their way by putting their hand on his shoulder and said, "It has been many years since we last saw one another." Leo smiled and said, "Yes, it has been quite a while." They explained that they had seen him on the highway with the couple 1 year earlier, trying to convince the man to come and see them firsthand, and they were hoping the man would follow. They told Leo, "This man knew of our existence. He had seen us before. Instead of believing in us, he allowed his fear to convince him that we are a threat. He prefers to think that we do not exist. He has closed his mind to everything. Why people continue to fear us, we do not know." So the ET invited Leo back to the ship. The other 5 men approached and made the customary greeting, and as one, they said, "It is the most welcome sight to see you again. We regret that your brother cannot be here with us. We enjoyed him very much." Inside the craft, Leo felt right at home. He saw the familiar chairs and screen. He sat down and spoke with them very casually. They talked about his attempt to show his daughters and expressed regret that the girls had been too frightened. One of them told Leo that in the last 3 years, the people of Earth were trying to learn how to detect and capture their craft, and he told them, "Your science and technology have advanced enough to pose a threat to our ships as well as to the planet." And at this point they actually showed him an image of an atomic explosion. As the ET said, "If your military leaders continue their efforts to damage our ships, we will be forced to defend ourselves. Although we have been seriously provoked, we will not treat man like he treats us. Our actions to protect and defend ourselves are governed by a simple principle. Anything that is thrown at us will be thrown back to its source." So they told him many things. They told him that they believed that this would likely happen in the future, this atomic explosion. They made it clear that the people of Earth were traveling down an irreversible pathway toward self-destruction, which very much saddened them. Finally, the meeting was over. They left the craft. They stood outside for some moments watching the stars and told him that they would not see each other for quite some time as they were returning to their home, but that later a larger ship would be returning to the area in 1971 through 1973. They departed as old friends. Again, they lit the way back to his car, and to Leo's amazement, even started the car for him. Once in his car, he turned around and there was no sign of the craft. And again, this turned out to be his last encounter. But the effects of their visit would last for the rest of his life. As Leo says, as the years then have gone by, everything they told us has happened, though sometimes with strange and unexpected twists. How they knew these things in advance, I do not know. So Leo does have one final message from the ETs. As he says, their actions and behavior were always calm and considerate. I cannot imagine one of them making a mistake in anything. They are perfect role models, the kind of people each of us would like to be when we grow up. That is one of their most important messages. Mankind must grow up and mature to be entitled to possess their knowledge and abilities. I know they are very concerned about our nuclear and chemical weapons and our warlike nature. So growing up, Leo and his family did experience a lot of bigotry and discrimination and greed from other people. But as Leo writes, we did not experience discrimination, suspicion, greed, and hatred when we were with these people from the stars. That is the most important thing I can tell you about them. They are kind and understanding and love us in spite of our dangerous behavior. These great men willingly took the time to speak to two grubby little farm kids in North Dakota and changed our lives forever. You'll agree that is one of the most astonishing UFO contact cases on record. Leo Dworshak thankfully did write a book about it in 2003. It's called UFOs Are With Us, Take My Word. And when I saw this book, I knew I had to get a copy. It's truly an incredible book. It's quite short and written in a very sort of sparse style, very direct, but absolutely astonishing. He tells his story with incredible honesty and sincerity. I enjoyed the book very much. I cannot recommend it enough. I was only really able to cover a tiny portion of the things that he's learned, so I think you'll learn a lot more if you do have the chance to read this book. I was so impressed by the book that I actually wrote to Leo and we enjoyed a brief correspondence together. I urged him to send the book to the MUFON UFO Journal so it could get a review because I really felt that this book deserved a much wider audience. And to my delight, he did. And in the next issue of the MUFON Journal, the editor, Dwight Connolly, devoted an unheard of 3-page long review of the book. So he was clearly impressed. And this did lead to more publicity because UK researcher Timothy Good, one of my favorite researchers actually, heard about the book and he actually traveled from England all the way to Montana to meet Leo Dworshak face to face, interview him, talk to his family. He got lots of confirmation of this event from Leo's family and ended up covering Leo's case in his book Earth and Alien Enterprise, and devoted, in fact, the first chapter of his book to Leo's experiences. So this is a case that deserves a lot more publicity. I hope you have a chance to check out the book. Sadly, Leo passed away in April 2007. He was 86 years old, so he got this book out just in time. He published it just 4 years earlier. So very sad, but really glad that he did find the courage and the fortitude and the strength to tell his story publicly. So that's it for today. Thank you guys. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I truly appreciate your watching. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. Most important of all, keep having fun. And I will see you next time. Bye for now.